As you'll know, if you have been around here any length of time, I don't usually preach from the epistle reading. I preach mostly from the gospel, occasionally from the Old Testament, and rarely from the epistle. In my view, those readings don't often preach well. That's a term we use in our profession. Will that text preach, or will that anecdote preach? It means our way of saying, will this text, will I be able to present it in a way that it finds purchase in your hearts? And we usually think, and it's usually the case, that the Gospels just preach better. But another part of my reluctance to preach from the epistle is Paul's sometimes confusing language and tortured logic. Romans chapter 7 comes to mind. If you haven't read it, check it out after church. The passage from last week from 1 Corinthians chapter 8 also comes to mind, and it continues, frankly, at least for me, into today's lesson, 1 Corinthians chapter 9. I could go on. It's a struggle with me and Paul. Here's the point. Sometimes when I read Paul's letters, I have that reading experience that you may have had. I have to go back and read and reread slowly, sometimes write it out, take notes, go back again, read it again. I think I have it figured out, then I get confused by it again. Eventually, I can tease it out, usually, untangle it. But sometimes it simply presents as very tangled. Although I have to say, as I was listening, I thought to myself, if I could just get Bob to narrate Paul's letters for me, I might be able to understand them better, because there's something about the way that you read that it rung clear to me when you were reading it. Now, Paul's writings are certainly inspired, and oftentimes they are simple and beautiful. And of course they do, as the language that we use in the prayer book. They contain things that are necessary for our salvation, and therefore they're not to be neglected. It's just that at times they don't preach easily. Here's an example from today's reading that we just heard. Paul writes, "If I proclaim the gospel, this gives me no ground for boasting, for an obligation is laid on me, and woe to me if I do not proclaim the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I'm entrusted with a commission." And that's where I start to go off the rails. What then is my reward? And off he goes, and by the time we're done, I'm confused and turned around and left scratching my head, trying to tease apart and untangle and straighten for my own understanding what seems like a tangled bowl of theological spaghetti. It can be done. We can get there. It just takes some doing, and that doing doesn't usually lend itself to good preaching. So, homiletical discretion would be the better part of valor here, I suppose, but I'm going to go for it, because foolish preachers rush in where angelic preachers fear to tread. So, here we go. I have to say, to be fair, Paul can't be blamed entirely for the difficulty of this passage. An equally contributing factor is the fact that we have it taken out of context. The passage that we heard from chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians, we heard verses 16 to 23. That has everything to do with chapter 9, verses 1 through 15. And in fact, that has everything to do with chapter 8 as well, some of which we covered last week. So, in an attempt to help us wrap our head around this passage, let's have a quick review of last week. Here's what we learned. There is a lot of freedom in the Christian life for those whose faith is strong. Love God and do what you will, because the strength of your faith will guide you into good decisions and right actions. But if your exercise of your Christian freedom causes someone who is weak in the faith to stumble, to fall, to sin, well then, out of love for your weaker brother or sister, give away some of your Christian freedom. The duty of Christian love always outranks the principle of Christian freedom. Then at the very end of chapter 8, Paul puts an exclamation point on his teaching, saying essentially, of course there's nothing wrong with eating meat sacrificed to idols. Those of us who are strong in the faith could be completely free to do so. But if my doing so causes one of my weaker brothers or sisters to fall in their faith, I'll give up not just meat sacrificed to idols, but all meat for the rest of my life. That's how much I love you. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Reader's Digest style. That's what we had last week. It feeds right into the first part of chapter 9, which we also didn't get to hear. Paul is continuing the conversation, continuing to illustrate the argument of love trumps freedom. In that part, and here, as an aside, I'll say here, you'll get perhaps an even clearer glimpse into why most wise preachers never touch this stuff. Because in the first part of chapter 9, Paul is continuing the point by saying something else that he has given up for the sake of love, namely his preacher's salary. The first 15 verses, Paul explains why he deserves to be paid for his work as a preacher, a teacher, a missionary, a pastor. And he makes a very good case for it. And then he says, but out of love, I refuse to take any salary from you in case my being paid for preaching causes those who are weak to fall or causes in any way my motives to be impugned. He's basically saying, I deserve to be paid for being your pastor, but I love you so much that I'm going to refuse that pay. My reward is in the preaching. And that is why you'll never hear a sermon from an ordained preacher today about the first 15 verses of chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians. We don't want you to get any ideas. Well, Father Tom, don't you love us as much as Paul loved the Corinthians? So setting aside that particular example for a moment, or forever, the theological principle remains. Strong Christian brothers and sisters should be willing to sacrifice some of their freedoms out of the love for those who are weaker or for those who do not yet know Jesus. And the reward comes simply in the self-giving. Now for today's part, verses 16 to 23. Not only should we be willing to give up some things for those who are weaker in the faith or who don't have faith, we should be willing to do so joyfully. We should be overcome with gratitude that God has given us the opportunity and the blessing to give ourselves away for the love of others and for the sake of the gospel. Paul opens the doorway into that by saying, I have to proclaim the gospel. It's an obligation. I don't deserve any thanks or praise or reward for doing what I'm obliged to do. Woe to me if I don't do it. When I read that, it reminded me of something that happened years and years ago when I was I had first gotten to, my first church was St. Mark's over in Ortega. And my son Liam was about 4, I think, at the time. And we had, before we were there, when I was at seminary, we lived on a farm. And so he never saw the mailman. The mailbox was way down the driveway at the street. He didn't know anything about a mailman. When we moved to Ortega, our house was right on the street there, and it had one of those doors with the mail slot in the door. And my son was finally introduced to what a mailman was. And he was just taken by the fact that every day that little slot would open and a guy would put mail through the mail slot. And because of his disability, he has a hard time reading social cues. It was cute when he was 4 anyways. Not long after we got there, he would rush to see when the mailman was coming. And then one day he came running up to the door, and I was kind of looking out the side light there of the door, and the slot opened, and the mail came in, and he grabbed that mail slot, and he yelled out as loud as he could, "I love you, mailman!" And I could see the mailman get kind of startled, and first I thought it was very cute, and then he did it the next day, and I could see that maybe it wasn't the best idea. I said, "Son, that's lovely, but you don't have to tell the mailman that you love him." And he was a little bit perplexed by that. And so the next day, when the mailman came, he said, "Thank you, mailman," just yelled right out through the slot. And I said, "That's better, I guess." And I was trying to explain to a little child. I said, "You don't even really have to say thank you to the mailman." Well, I have an older daughter who I was trying to teach manners, and then she asked me, "Why don't we have to say thank you to the mailman?" I said, "Well, you can. It's nice to say thank you to the mailman, but he's not doing you a favor. He's obliged to put the mail through the slot. It belongs to us. He has it. He has to put it through. I said, you can be polite and say thank you, but he's obliged. We don't necessarily always thank people for doing what they are expected to do. Woe to him, you might say, if he had our mail and he didn't put it through the mail slot. That's where Paul is going with his preaching. Brings us to the final takeaway for today, I think, from Paul in chapters 8 and 9 of 1 Corinthians. And if you've been around for a while, you'll recognize it. It's the same takeaway that we have so often from the Gospels. Give yourself away in love, for the love of others, freely and joyfully, and be rewarded simply by the joy that comes from doing so. Help others to be stronger in the faith. And this is really, I think, why this passage spoke to me, because it relates right back to our strategic imperatives here at Christ Church. Help others to be stronger in their faith and do so joyfully and thankfully. That's the way that we strengthen those who already know Christ but aren't yet strong in that faith. That's what we call discipleship. Giving ourselves away in love, that's the way we make disciples, and that's the way that we proclaim the gospel to those who haven't yet heard it. Our other strategic imperative, evangelism. We do those things by giving ourselves away in love, for love, joyfully and thankfully. That's the way we find touch points and common ground, both with our unchurched neighbors and with our not quite yet strong in the faith brothers and sisters. By loving them and by giving ourselves away joyfully to them. That is, to borrow Paul's language, that is how we win them for the sake of the gospel, that we may share in its blessings. Our reward, simply the joy of living lives of love and proclamation and invitation. I put it another way. 2 weeks ago, from this spot, I invited us all to be fishermen for the gospel and for the kingdom. Right? 2 weeks ago, we got to be fishermen. Today, we get to be mailmen, letter carriers of the gospel for the kingdom. Our reward, just the simple joy of delivering the mail. And perhaps, if we do so, every once in a while, when we put the gospel of love into the mail slot of someone's heart, every once in a while, we might just be blessed enough to hear an enthusiastic voice call out, "I love you, mailman." Amen.